People are often used to the bury my heart at Wounded Knee narrative of Native Americans, which is as victims. But the narrative that I told was a narrative of power, dominance, of power, which came with brutality too. And I think it was a fact.
This race that wiped out their tribes. The history of America is one that has always been shrouded in controversy and outlandish discussions. For years, many have postulated theories about how humans came to settle on this continent, as well as how they evolved into the people you see today. Like every evolution story, however, the answers many of us seek tend to be hidden in texts and writings delivered by those who came before. And in the case of America's history, it's safe to say that there is definitely a lot to go by. Still, even though it's been declared now that Native Americans were the first to inhabit these lands, the focus has now shifted more toward how they managed to survive on the grassy, unforgiving plains. And well, let's just say that these Native Americans definitely had to do a lot to get by. In this video, we'll be looking at a few facts that experts have been able to glean from historical records, including an interesting discovery about a tribe that was especially threatening toward Native Americans in the early days. Quick history of the Native Americans. Before we get deep into the way of life of the Native Americans, it might be worth exploring who these people were and how they even managed to settle on the continent in the first place. Essentially, the Native Americans are tribes of indigenous people who lived in the United States, also known as American Indians, or the first Americans. These were basically the initial people who settled on the continent and made it their home. And for many decades, they lived relatively nomadic lives, roaming the plains and traveling across the landscape. To date, no one really knows where the Native Americans emerged from, or even the exact date when they settled in the Americas. However, the most popular theory for this is that they were people who migrated from Eurasia across Beringia, a land bridge that connected present-day Alaska to Siberia, and then moved south all through the Americas as time went on. A few years ago, experts discovered fossilized human footprints in lake sediments close to White Sands National Park in New Mexico, and they believed that this discovery pointed to a human presence in the region dating back to the last glacial maximum between 18,000 and 26,000 years ago. At the same time, genetic evidence has also suggested the presence of at least 3 waves of migrants arriving from East Asia, with the first one happening around 15,000 years ago. That said, there are also those who believe that human existence in the Americas must have been even older. One such expert is Graham Hancock, a researcher and historian who recently shared evidence that there were human remains on American soil as far back as 130,000 years ago.
The Cerruti Mastodon site is another extraordinary site. My God, I mean, those Clovis police are saying humans were only in America for 13,000 years ago. Here's a site that shows humans were in America 130,000 years ago, 10 times as long.
Graham's discovery pointed to the Cerruti Mastodon site in California's San Diego County. The site was first discovered decades ago, but in 1992 and 1993, a team of researchers from the San Diego Natural History Museum excavated the site and made it possible for it to finally be explored. In 2017, researchers confirmed that they had indeed found broken mastodon bones at the site, as well as additional evidence that these mastodons were indeed killed by humans. The remains and artifacts were carbon dated and found to have been at least 130,000 years old. Nevertheless, many of these findings have yet to be fully accepted by the scientific community, something Graham alludes to as the scientists being stubborn and unwilling to accept new knowledge for the sake of pride. And for that reason, the prevailing knowledge remains that the earliest Native Americans must have settled on the landscape somewhere between 18,000 and 26,000 years ago. The legend of the white giants. Anyway, if there is one thing that tends to stick out about the Native Americans, it's the fact that they were very varied. Over time, the Native American people split into different tribes, each with its own laws, customs, and general way of life. And although there were similarities between them all, the differences among them also made for easy identification and distinction. Like every other settlement, there were times when these Native American tribes had conflict with one another. And at the same time, there were periods when they enjoyed relative peace. Soon enough, the Native Americans developed into a civilization of their own, characterized by a connection with nature, a nomadic lifestyle, and a desire to expand beyond the landscape and take over more territories. Today, the descendants of indigenous American tribes are still very much in existence. We see much of them concentrated in states such as Alaska, Oklahoma, and Denver, although several other states across the country also have their own pockets of Native American populations. For many of these modern-day descendants of Native Americans, much of what they know about their ancestors comes from access to ancient texts and writings passed down to them for generations. These texts have passed down incredibly valuable lessons and spiritual values, as well as legends that have endured through the times. One of the most enduring legends passed down through generations is the legend of the White Giants. According to this legend, white giants once lived and roamed our world, and several Native American tribes actually encountered them. In general, the legend of the White Giants has actually changed several times, mostly because different Native American tribes have their own versions of it. For instance, the Cherokee tribe called them the Moon People, while the Paiutes and UTEs spoke of a race of hideous cannibals that were about 10 feet tall and who lived in caves. At the same time, the Choctaw tribe also has an account of giants measuring about 9 feet in height that first colonized what is now known as the Ohio Valley. Still, there were some lines of convergence in the different versions of this legend. For instance, it is said that the Native Americans had to fight these white giants when they arrived in the Mississippi and when they tried to migrate from the west. The giants were said to have been very unfriendly to the Native American population at the time, although the Comanches claimed to have been in contact with them when they still roamed the earth. From the Comanches, we see a picture of a race of giants that were stronger, taller, and far more physically superior than any other race present in the world at the time. Much of the account from the Comanches came from a speech given by Chief Rolling Thunder of the tribe. The speech, which was recorded back in 1857, provides a rather vivid description of the white giants in question. Innumerable moons ago, a race of white men, 10 feet high, and far more rich and powerful than any white people now living, here inhabited a large range of country, extending from the rising to the setting sun. Their fortifications crowned the summits of the mountains, protecting their populous cities situated in the intervening valleys. They excelled every other nation which was flourished, either before or since, in all manner of cunning handicraft, were brave and warlike, ruling over the land they had wrested from its ancient possessors with a high and haughty hand. Compared with them, the pale faces of the present day were pygmies in both art and arms. Despite their seeming cannibalistic nature, Rolling Thunder explained that the white giants were also said to have been skilled at building. According to his account and several other Native American legends, these giants built cities full of life and even accommodating. However, their savage and wild nature was never fully kept in check, and in time they were eventually wiped out by the Great Spirit. In the version of the Navajo tribe, the giants were skilled miners who dominated their surrounding communities. They had a very strong hold over the American plain, mostly because they were skilled at gathering natural resources and using those resources to build. But even with their dominance, the giants were said to have vanished at some point. Navajo legends posit that they either returned to the heavens or were extinguished by a great and unknown force. Another interesting perspective comes from the Manta people, who believe that the giants arrived in the Americas on boats. The legend doesn't necessarily say where they came from, only that they almost immediately began to take over the surrounding areas. The giants were said to have been massive creatures, with eyes as large as dinner plates. However, this huge size just might have been what led to their undoing. The giants were said to have had revolting sexual behaviors, and this angered the Great Spirit so much that it ended up exterminating them altogether. The Americas, home to a lost civilization? With everything that's been said, you might be wondering, where is the proof of these giants? Well, as things stand, there isn't much. All we have to go by are the stories and legends shared by the Native Americans who lived centuries ago, although these legends definitely painted vivid pictures of these giants and how they lived. Several experts have gone on to search for proof that these giants existed, but not much has come out of that effort, and the lack of evidence has led many to believe these giants might not necessarily have been giants in the literal sense. I mean, maybe they were just a different race that we haven't seen before. The ancient Native Americans could very well have been speaking in parables or using the word giant to refer to a different race or species of creatures that they encountered. So it is possible that they simply used the word in the loosest of possible terms here. That said, there has been evidence that a lost civilization indeed existed in America, much longer than the Native Americans themselves. I already mentioned earlier that Graham Hancock discussed what he believed to be conclusive proof of an old ancient civilization that inhabited these lands much earlier than scientists are willing to believe. And Graham himself has been adamant in his belief that there truly were humans who predated indigenous tribes. To expand his theory, Graham made an appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience a few years ago. Now, if you know anything about Joe Rogan, it's that he has always been willing to ask the tough questions and consider viewpoints that don't necessarily align with what mainstream outlets say. And on his show, Graham pointed to some truly compelling evidence that suggests the existence of a much older civilization in the Americas. Graham specifically used the example of the Moundville archaeological site, a Mississippian culture site on the Black Warrior River close to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. According to him, the site was said to have contained several Egyptian cultural and religious artifacts, a sign that an ancient civilization must have existed there.
Before Moundville was created, the end of ancient Egypt, there's Moundville. What is odd about it is we find this system of ancient Egyptian ideas in Moundville 500 years after ancient Egypt has gone from the world.
Interestingly, Graham also points out what he believes to be specific preconditions that need to be fulfilled for anyone who would like to propose a lost civilization that must have walked the earth before anyone else knew.
Is what the new evidence is pointing to is that the Americas have been wrongly neglected, that here we have a giant continental landmass with extraordinary resources that has just been ruled out of the story of human civilization.
In many ways, Graham isn't necessarily wrong here. When you think about the theories of human civilization and the origins of our race, most people tell you that we originated from Europe, Mesopotamia, Ethiopia, or some other idyllic location. However, Graham challenges this view, presenting the Americas as a possible starting point for humanity as well. He definitely makes a solid point. The Americas are a vast mass of land with an enormous wealth of resources that could easily support a civilization. So while most mainstream scientists tend to rule out this continent as the starting point of humanity, it just could be the missing link we've all been looking for. Spotlight on the Comanches. The Native Americans who lived in the early days of the continent were definitely a force to be reckoned with. Their tribes were vast and broad, spreading across the landscape in a way that hadn't been seen before. Even though many of them generally wanted to just dwell in the land, there were also a few of these tribes that were fierce and ready to battle when the situation called for it. The most notable of these Native American tribes were the Comanches. This tribe lived around the southern plain of the United States, particularly in states such as Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the Comanches were a notable Native American tribe practicing a distinct nomadic horse culture. They mostly hunted bison while also trading with other tribes, as well as colonists and settlers. With more of a European presence being felt across the continent in the latter part of this period, the Comanches waged war on these settlers and pillaged their land. But the Europeans weren't the only ones to feel the wrath of this mighty tribe. Even neighboring Native American tribes were also raided, with Comanche warriors taking their people captive during warfare and even selling them to the Spanish and Mexican settlers as laborers. At the same time, thousands of captives from Native American, Mexican, and Spanish settlers were eventually assimilated back into Comanche society. And at its peak, the Comanche language was the official lingo of the Great Plains region. It should go without saying that warfare was a huge part of Comanche life. These warriors were formidable, and they devised several strategies for using traditional weapons to fight on horseback. Their raids into Mexico usually happened during the full moon, when their soldiers could comfortably see and ride at night. In fact, the prevalence of these raids was what led to the term Comanche Moon, where these soldiers raided for captives, beasts of burden, and weapons. The tribe's warriors could easily engage in raids running hundreds of miles into Mexican territory, and their raids were definitely the stuff of legend. A lot has been said about the ferocity and the exploits of the Comanche tribe, but while several stories depict them as fierce fighters and warriors, It's important also to note that these people were pretty savage. In an episode of The Joe Rogan Experience, S.C. Gwynn, a writer and historian, explained that the period when the Great Plains were ruled by the Comanche was definitely no easy shakes.
In the reservation period, when people found out who he was, he identified as part of the Parker family also.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so he as a famous Comanche war chief, and he was one of the most famous and feared, he was Quanah.
It's such a crazy story that they killed so many people, but occasionally they would keep people and bring them into the tribe.
It's pretty interesting when you think about it. The Comanches were fierce warriors, but they were also very desensitized to violence. As it would appear, all those years of fighting and waging war against other tribes pretty much left them numb to the entire process. Instead of being squeamish at the sight of blood or being sympathetic to the plight of other people who might need help, these warriors were battle-hardened and were focused on their mission. Surely this must have been a challenging life by all accounts. And in the hard-knock life of the Great Plains, the Comanches were perfectly built to handle whatever adversity came their way, even if it meant being completely numb to the plight of others. Interestingly, Mr. Gwynn also pointed out that one of the major secrets of the Comanches was the fact that they mastered their horses so well.
The tribes that got the horse and mastered the horse basically altered the entire balance of power on the plains. And the tribe that got the horse better than anybody else in terms of breaking and breeding and saddling and riding and stealing and hunting on the back of and fighting with were the Comanches, and nobody was their peer.
This is another valid point here. Apart from being fierce warriors, the Comanches understood that they needed to develop a level of understanding of horses, which at the time were the popular beasts of burden. So they devoted a considerable amount of time to breeding, breaking, and mastering horses to ensure they could easily ride out and get things done. With their understanding and mastery of horses, the Comanches easily became the dominant power in the Great Plains. And for decades, they were feared across the region for their ferocity and ability to hit their opponents fast and hard. As of 1832, Comanche chiefs told the famous American traveler George Catlin that their tribe numbered up to 40,000 people, with a fifth of that number being pure warriors. This population was confirmed by Etienne de Vignard, Sieur de Bourgmont, a French explorer famous for documenting his travels on the Missouri and Platte rivers in North America. According to Bourgmont, a Comanche chief told him the tribe had 12 villages in total, and when he visited one of those villages, he found no less than 800 soldiers. So if the other villages were just as populous, it meant that the Comanche soldiers must have amounted to almost 10,000. That said, it didn't take so long for the population to begin declining. And even more interesting, it appeared that later accounts of the Comanches captured this decline. For instance, by 1774, a French trader named J. Gagnard wrote that a single division of the Comanche called the Natan had 4,000 warriors split into 4 separate bands. Less than a decade later, Spaniard explorers estimated that the total population of the Comanche tribe was about 40,000. Around the year 1820, American explorer Jedediah Morse estimated that the tribe amounted to about 38,000 people. But the population continued to decline, reaching just about 19,200 people less than 2 decades later. Eventually, the real decline in the population of the Comanche tribe really started to hit by the second half of the 19th century. A census conducted in 1890 found less than 2,000 Comanches in Oklahoma, and the numbers pretty much continued to dwindle since then. A slow, painful decline. The gradual reduction in the Comanche population really gives us cause to think, if the Native Americans were such a dominant force on the population at the time, how and why is it that they ended up being almost entirely wiped out? Well, there were several reasons for this. First was the fact that European settlers began to grow in number across the Americas. And with this came an increase in conflict and fights that swept through the continent entirely. Soon enough, more and more European countries began to settle, and Native American tribes started getting pushed out of their land. Then there's also the American Revolution, the fight for America to finally be free of European, and particularly British control. During this conflict, American patriots competed with the British for the allegiance of the Native Americans, particularly those who were located east of the Mississippi River. But at the end of the day, most Native Americans sided with the British thanks to their trading relationships and a hope that defeat for the Americans would put a stop to American expansion into their land. Thousands of Native American warriors died during the Revolutionary War, and as time went on, their land became even more encroached upon as their populations also dwindled. To make things even worse, the British eventually made peace with the Americans in the famous Treaty of Paris in 1783. As part of this agreement, the British ceded massive swaths of Native American territories to the United States, all without any prior warning or consultation with the Native Americans who would have been most affected. With the British now out of the way, American settlers were able to step into Native American land once again and begin shaping it in the way they saw fit. These settlers were eager to expand their territories, and they developed hunting and farming grounds in different areas. At the same time, the general government policy towards Native Americans had changed a lot during this time. Leaders such as Henry Knox and even George Washington were of the opinion that Native Americans were equals, but that they were from an inferior society. So they began a policy to civilize these Native Americans. This meant educating Native American children and adults in European ways, as well as integrating them into the larger society. Soon enough, more Native Americans began to drop the native part of their identity to simply identify as being American. A final factor that also led to the decimation of the Native American population was the rise of diseases and illnesses. By the turn of the 19th century, the population of California Indians had dropped by a staggering 90%. There were about 250,000 at the start of the century, but this number dropped drastically to 200, 00, and then just 15,000 when the century ended. Much of this was due to diseases. Several epidemics swept through the California Indian country at this time, with the most notable being the malaria epidemic of 1833. At the time, Spanish authorities had forced many native Californians to live in the missions, where they contracted diseases that left them with little to no immunity whatsoever. According to some experts, about 45% of the population decrease in the missions was caused by diseases. For instance, there were two separate epidemics of measles, one in 1806 and another in 1828. Epidemics such as these led to incredibly high mortality rates among the Native Americans. Speaking about the impact of these epidemics, Joe Rogan even points out an even gnarlier stat. In a separate episode of his podcast with comedian Brian Callen, Joe shared some scary insights into the impact of diseases on the Native American community, as well as its role in absolutely decimating their population.
Same thing.
Yeah.
They wiped out 90, a lot of people think that the genocide of the Native Americans was just European soldiers and people and settlers killing Native Americans, which did happen.
Yeah, but it was also influenza.
But 90% of them were killed by disease.
Yeah.
90%, like the entire population.
As part of the California Gold Rush, many Native Americans were also killed by incoming settlers and militia units that were financed by the state government. Some experts have stated that this action constituted a massive genocide of the Native Californians. And the sad thing is that there were several other examples of this happening around the country. So you see, there were several factors that really led to the demise of the Native American population. Some of these factors were man-made, as it appeared that the civilization just wasn't able to adapt as things changed, and the establishment of modern-day America didn't necessarily have space for them. At the same time, there was also the impact of diseases and illnesses that really got to them. In more ways than one, the decimation of the Native Americans even predated the establishment of the Wild West. And one of the many hallmarks of this period on the American frontier was the prevalence of diseases and illnesses. It would appear that these diseases actually came from Native American times and only got worse as time went on. Outro. Without a doubt, the Native Americans were a fascinating people. They settled in the Americas during a time when the land was largely unexplored, and they pretty much made it their home. But even with all that comfort, the destruction of their civilization was also fascinating to see, albeit sad indeed. What do you think, though? Would you have loved to visit the continent when the Native Americans were prevalent? Were there really giants that lived on this land long before the Native Americans even got here? Let us know in the comments.